It happened in 1993 when I was young and full of ambition. The world was changing, and especially Russia, a country I never thought fate would bring me to. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this land was like the Wild West, full of opportunities, but also dangers. My company, eager to stay ahead in exploring new markets, sent me, a geologist, to investigate potential deposits of rare minerals somewhere deep in Siberia, in the heart of Yakutia. Autumn was already in full swing, and my colleagues kept reminding me that Russia's cold would arrive earlier than I could imagine. I must admit, having grown up in sunny Texas, I had no idea what real cold was. So my first order of business was to shop for supplies: a thick winter coat, wool sweaters, thermal underwear, and of course, a hat. My assistant, giggling, suggested I should also get a ushanka, the famous Russian fur hat with ear flaps. I ignored her advice, a decision I would later regret. Preparations went quickly. Just a couple of days later, I was already on a plane bound for Moscow. The flight was long, and the closer we got to Russia, the more I felt an odd sense of unease. Not fear, but a dull foreboding, as if I were stepping onto territory that harbored mysteries beyond my understanding. Moscow greeted me with a gray sky and the noise of a massive airport. People around me spoke a language I didn't understand, and everywhere I turned, I saw stern faces. This was nothing like the Russia I had imagined from romantic books about the Russian soul. Everything here seemed rough, cold, and detached. I spent less than a day in Moscow, catching a connecting flight to Yakutsk. Flying farther east, I looked out the window to see endless snowy expanses below, and a small voice inside me whispered, "You're not ready for this." When I set foot on Yakutian soil, it was already late evening. The air was crisp and freezing, so pure that breathing it almost hurt. Snow blanketed the ground, covering it like a white shroud. The station was small, modest, and seemed to stand at the edge of the world. I was met by a man who stood out from the crowd with his massive build, a thick beard, and a sturdy coat that reminded me of old Russian films. "Ivan," he introduced himself, extending a hand clad in a fur mitten. His accent was harsh, and his English was strange, as if he had just started learning it. "You... John?" I nodded and shook his hand. It was cold but firm, much like everything else here seemed to be. Ivan led me to a vehicle that looked more like a war survivor than a car. It was an old UAZ, a Russian Jeep, as if pulled straight from another era. The body was rusty but imposing, and the engine growled in a way that filled me with both doubt and respect. "This... our car," Ivan said, patting the hood. "Siberian tank, good. Doesn't break. Often." I smirked and threw my luggage inside. The interior smelled of gasoline, leather, and something metallic. Ivan motioned for me to get in, and we set off. The journey was long, winding, and riddled with bumps. Occasionally, Ivan tried to strike up a conversation, telling me about hunting and life in these parts. I understood only half of it, but his words sounded sincere. Outside the window stretched an endless tundra, lifeless and beautiful at the same time. Trees stood like sentinels of an ancient world, and the snow glistened in the moonlight. The road was treacherous. Ivan cursed every pothole and icy rut, but his UAZ stubbornly pushed forward, as if it had been built specifically for these harsh conditions. The deeper we ventured into the wilderness, the fewer signs of life we encountered. I began to doubt we were heading anywhere at all when the faint silhouettes of village houses appeared on the horizon. The place looked as though time had stopped 100 years ago. A small village, humbly perched at the edge of the tundra, lay buried under a heavy blanket of snow. Old wooden houses with sagging roofs stood like silent ghosts, Some were clearly abandoned. Their windows were boarded up and doors hung askew on a single hinge. The air was biting cold, and even the dogs, which usually roamed freely in such places, seemed to be hiding from the frost. Ivan led me to one of the few houses that appeared inhabited. It was slightly better maintained than the others. Fresh smoke curled from its chimney and curtains hung in the windows. Ivan stopped the car and gestured for me to follow. "Alexei here," he said, patting his heavy coat, as if to emphasize the gravity of the moment. The door opened before we could knock. A man stood in the doorway. He was of average height, stocky, with sharp facial features. Thick mustaches framed his face, and his gaze was heavy and scrutinizing. He wore an old but sturdy padded jacket, and a worn fur hat sat snugly on his head. "Alexei," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Head of the village." I shook his hand. It was as hard as wood and cold, despite his warm clothing. There was an air of strength about him, but something in his gaze was unsettling. Perhaps it was my nature to distrust strangers, but this man seemed to be hiding more than he was willing to share. "We found the site," he began, staring directly into my eyes. His English was slightly better than Ivan's, but not by much. "Worker's mine, gold maybe, or something else." His words hung in the air as though he wanted to say more, but stopped himself. I nodded, trying not to reveal my doubts. "Come inside," he said, stepping aside. The house was small but warm. The centerpiece was a large stove that heated the entire room. Old photographs in simple wooden frames adorned the walls, and a massive wooden table stood in the corner, with rough benches in place of chairs. The creaky wooden floor was covered with a worn rug, and a bed with a thick fur blanket sat near a heavy chest. I set my belongings by the wall and looked around. The room was steeped in the scent of smoke, wood, and something else, perhaps age. It was as if nothing here had been new for decades. Yet despite its simplicity, the place felt surprisingly cozy. Alexei gestured to the chest. "You can put your things here." "Equipment? Where?" I pulled out my backpack and began laying out my gear. A compass, maps, and tools for analyzing rock samples. Alexei watched me with a faint curiosity, but said nothing. "The site is farther. UAZ ready?" he asked Ivan. Ivan nodded and motioned for me to follow. Time to go. I bundled myself up in the warmest clothes I had. A winter coat, scarf, hat, and gloves. Before leaving, I glanced back at the house. There was something strange about the way Alexei watched us from the doorway. His gaze seemed to hold a warning, though perhaps it was just my nerves. We climbed back into the UAZ. Ivan drove in silence, occasionally casting quick glances my way. Alexei had stayed behind in the village, and I couldn't decide whether I felt relieved or uneasy about it. The road grew worse, with deep snow and an icy wind seeping into the car despite its heavy doors. "Place? Interesting," Ivan finally said, nodding ahead. His tone was peculiar, as though he, too, had something to say but hesitated. I remained silent, staring out at the white void beyond the window. Somewhere out there, among these endless expanses, lay a mystery waiting to be uncovered. But what I didn't yet know was that this mystery would cost me almost everything. Night fell quickly, as it often does in such places. The sky darkened into a dense, almost tangible velvet. I sat in the car, gazing out at the endless tundra, when the engine suddenly started sputtering. The vehicle shook like an old ship caught in a storm. Ivan frowned, slamming his hand on the steering wheel in an attempt to regain control. The car fell silent, leaving only the cold wind outside and the occasional groan of metal to keep us company. Ivan muttered something under his breath in Russian, then opened the door with a loud thud and stepped out. I watched as he popped the hood. Thick steam billowed out, wrapping around his face like cigarette smoke, but 1,000 times thicker. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping out of the car. The air was freezing, and it felt like it pierced straight through my coat, making my body shiver involuntarily. "Old junk," he muttered curtly, not looking at me, then let out a string of curses that made it clear the news wasn't good. He slammed the hood shut and turned to face me. His expression was tense, and I noticed beads of sweat forming on his temple, despite the sub-zero temperature. "Finished. Car, no go," he said, struggling to explain that the vehicle was beyond saving. "We walk." Those words hit me like a blast of icy wind. Walk? Here? In this endless void. I looked around. All I could see was the white expanse stretching out like an infinite sea. No trees, no landmarks, just snow glittering faintly in the dying light. "Back?" I suggested uncertainly, but Ivan was already pulling our gear from the car. He gave me a look that suggested I was insane for even asking. "No, forward." He opened the trunk and pulled out a rifle, inspecting it briefly. "What's that for?" I asked, feeling a cold sweat run down my back. "Beast, maybe," he said in his broken English, and his words only deepened my unease. We walked in silence. Ivan trudged ahead, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. The cold seeped into my bones. I pulled my hat lower, but it felt as though no amount of clothing could shield me from this merciless climate. The snow darkened, blending almost seamlessly with the night sky. The moon, pale and solitary, provided little light to guide us. I watched Ivan, who occasionally glanced around as if searching for something. I wanted to ask him what, but fear of distracting him held me back. Perhaps he was looking for a place to shelter, or worse, something or someone that might be following us. "Ivan, are you sure we're going the right way?" I finally asked. He didn't respond, but soon came to an abrupt stop, as though he'd spotted something. "There!" he exclaimed with a rare note of excitement, kneeling down to dig through the snow. Beneath the white mass, a wooden door began to emerge, buried under the drifts. It was a dugout. We quickly cleared the entrance and opened the door. Inside, it was cold but still warmer than outside. The dugout was simple: a low ceiling, earthen walls, and an old stove with a pipe leading outside. Ivan immediately set about starting a fire with the wood we had brought. Soon the room filled with warmth and the comforting smell of burning wood. I looked around. The floor was covered with furs, likely reindeer, and some straw. In the corner stood a roughly built bench, piled with old rags. This place had clearly been abandoned for some time, but for now, it was our only refuge. "We wait here until morning," Ivan said, settling onto the furs. "Morning, we go. Close." I followed his lead, wrapping myself in one of the reindeer skins. The heat from the fire was soothing, but the unease in my chest lingered. I tried to sleep, but my mind churned with thoughts of freezing to death, or worse, encountering the beast Ivan had mentioned. Sometime in the night, a sound jolted me awake. It was the crunch of snow, distinct, deliberate, as though someone or something was walking outside. I froze, straining to listen. The steps were heavy and measured. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too precise, too human, or something larger. I glanced at Ivan. He was asleep, his face calm and his breathing steady. I didn't want to wake him, but fear got the better of me. I gently shook his shoulder. "Ivan," I whispered. He stirred, his eyes quickly finding mine. "What is it?" he mumbled, still groggy. "Something's outside." "I heard footsteps," I said. Ivan froze, listening intently. His face gradually paled. "Don't listen. Sleep," he said quietly. his voice tense. "What is it?" I pressed. "Just sleep," he repeated, avoiding my gaze. His words carried the weight of someone who knew what was out there but refused to say. I tried to calm myself, pulling the fur tighter around me. Fear still gripped me, but exhaustion eventually won. I drifted off only as the faint light of dawn began to seep through the dugout's narrow openings. Ivan woke me early, just as the sun began to break through the thick veil of snow on the horizon. His gruff voice pulled me from a restless sleep. "Get up. We need to go." I rubbed my eyes and sat up, feeling the chill of the dugout seep through my clothes. The stove had long gone cold, and the warmth from the previous night was nothing but a memory. Ivan had already gathered his belongings and stood by the door, silhouetted against the muted light outside. Quickly I dressed, pulling on my coat and grabbing my bag of equipment before following him out into the frigid morning. The moment I stepped outside, memories of the night's strange noises came flooding back. The icy air burned my lungs, but it was nothing compared to the tension tightening my nerves. I scanned the snow, searching for any signs of what I had heard. Ivan was already walking ahead, not looking back, but I hesitated. My eyes drifted across the snow, and then I saw them. Tracks. They were strange, not quite human, but not animal either. Each print was large, deeply pressed into the snow, and the toes. They seemed elongated, almost unnatural. I froze, my heart pounding faster. Who or what could have made these? "Damn it," I muttered under my breath. "What the hell is this?" I crouched to examine the tracks more closely. They were clearly made during the night. The cold gnawed at me more intensely now, though it was no longer just the temperature. It was fear. My rational mind struggled to keep up with the evidence before me. Something had walked through this desolate tundra, something too large to be human yet disturbingly humanoid. "John?" Ivan's voice broke through my thoughts. "Come still far!" I straightened, casting one last glance at the tracks, then hurried to catch up with him. My head was spinning with questions. What could have left those prints? I couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment I might see something appear on the horizon, something I desperately didn't want to meet. We walked for hours. The white expanse stretched endlessly, and each step through the deep snow drained my strength. Ivan moved with certainty, as though he knew exactly where he was going. But I couldn't shake the nagging thought that we were lost. This place looked the same in every direction, a boundless ocean of ice and snow. I felt like a grain of sand adrift in a sea of frost. "We'll freeze out here," I muttered to myself, trying not to fall behind. Dark thoughts swirled in my mind. What if we didn't find shelter? What if this tundra became our grave? Suddenly, Ivan stopped. I looked at him, ready to ask what was wrong, but he raised a hand, pointing behind us. "Look," he said. I turned. In the distance, back in the direction we had come from, a small dot appeared. It was moving. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the dot grew larger. Something, or someone, was following our trail. Ivan squinted, shielding his eyes from the glare. "People," he finally said, relief in his voice. The dot became a sled pulled by reindeer with two figures seated on it. As they drew closer, I could see one was an elderly man, his weathered face like leather scorched by the wind. The other was younger, with sharp, watchful eyes and a confident posture. Both had distinctively Asian features typical of the Yakut people, the Saha. As the sled approached, he raised a hand in greeting. The elderly man halted the reindeer, and the younger man studied us with a piercing gaze. After a brief exchange in a language I didn't understand, Ivan turned to me. "They'll take us. Going same place. Good." I nodded, feeling a wave of relief. Continuing on foot in this tundra was a death sentence. The men helped us load our things onto the sled. I climbed in behind the younger man, who deftly guided the reindeer. The animals were powerful, their fur glinting in the faint sunlight, their breaths steaming in the icy air. As we moved forward, a strange sense of calm washed over me. Perhaps it was the motion, or maybe the knowledge that we were no longer alone. Yet deep inside, a shadow of fear lingered. The tracks I had seen and the noises from the night before gnawed at my thoughts. I glanced at the elder Saha man seated across from me. His calm eyes held a depth of understanding, as though he knew these lands and their secrets, and perhaps even what I had seen last night. The sled glided smoothly over the snow, carrying us toward our destination. But now, that place felt less like a physical location and more like a looming mystery, one that promised to reveal something terrifying and unknown. We had been riding on the sled for about an hour. The icy air bit at my face, and I kept pulling my scarf higher, but the cold seeped through even the thickest layers of clothing. Ivan occasionally exchanged words with the old man sitting at the front. The conversations were terse, sometimes tense. The old man frowned, replying in short, clipped phrases. The young man steering the sled looked uneasy. His eyes darted nervously between the old man and us, and I noticed a hint of fear in his expression. Even without understanding the language, I could feel the tension rising. After some time, the sled came to an abrupt stop. The old man turned to Ivan and began speaking louder, almost shouting. The younger Saha looked as though he wanted to intervene but held back, clearly intimidated. Ivan responded sharply, his voice rough and agitated. I had no idea what was happening, but the strain in the air was palpable. The young man finally averted his eyes, focusing on the reindeer. Ivan suddenly jumped off the sled and motioned for me to follow him. "Come," he said, not even looking at me. The old man shouted something after him, then snapped the reins. The sled turned back, heading down the same path we had taken to get there. Their faces were tense, almost frightened. That fear settled into me like the cold creeping under my skin. "What's going on? Why are they leaving?" I asked, watching the sled disappear into the distance. Ivan stopped and turned to me. His expression was grim. I asked them to take us to the site, but they are superstitious. They say we can't go there. They're scared. He gestured toward the retreating sled. "Idiots." His voice was filled with frustration. I fell silent, but my mind raced. What could make them so afraid of this place? What was out here, in this desolate tundra, that could terrify even people who lived in such harsh conditions? Ivan, ignoring my unease, pressed on. We trudged through the snow for miles. The snow crunched beneath our boots, the cold intensified, and the silence of the tundra was broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind. He walked ahead, forging a path with steady determination. I followed, my thoughts growing darker with each step. What if we never made it out of this icy wasteland? Our vehicles were gone, and all that surrounded us was an endless expanse of white. After some time, Ivan slowed and pointed ahead. "Look, almost there," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. I squinted. In the distance, a black dot broke the monotony of the snowy landscape. It grew larger as we approached, resolving into an old railroad car. I had seen similar structures before, converted into makeshift shelters by locals. A thin plume of smoke rose from a pipe jutting out of the roof, indicating that someone was inside. Ivan didn't bother knocking. He opened the door and stepped in, motioning for me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped through the threshold. Inside, the warmth hit me immediately, but so did the stench. The place was a mess. The floor was littered with trash, bottles, old rags, scraps of newspaper. The table was piled with leftover food and more bottles, most of them empty and tipped over. The air was thick with the smell of alcohol and stale smoke. 2 men lay on the beds in the corner, sleeping so soundly they almost looked dead. Ivan walked over to one and shook him by the shoulder. The man mumbled something incoherent, not opening his eyes, and rolled onto his side. The other man didn't even stir, his loud snores filling the room. Ivan cursed under his breath and turned away. "Drunk," he muttered, waving a hand dismissively. He moved to the improvised kitchen, rummaging through the clutter for anything useful. I stood in the center of the room, taking in the chaos. One thought consumed me. How are we supposed to get out of here? The car was broken, abandoned in the tundra. There was no vehicle near the railroad car, and these men were in no condition to take us anywhere. Fear crept back into my chest. This railroad car, these men, this endless tundra. It all felt surreal, like a dream growing darker and more unsettling by the moment. We had no choice. Ivan said we had to wait until the 2 men woke up, and I had no option but to follow his lead. He gestured for me to join him at the makeshift kitchen, a cramped corner of the rail car with a wooden table covered in a filthy oilcloth, an old iron stove that still carried the faint scent of burnt coal, and a pile of rusted pots and pans. The floor was littered with crumbs and trash, and a cluster of empty bottles stood in the corner like some bizarre decoration. Ivan rummaged through one of the cabinets and found a few slices of stale bread, a can of stew, and an old kettle. He motioned for me to sit, and soon enough, he placed a rough but hearty meal on the table. I ate in silence, watching him. He seemed entirely unfazed by the strange atmosphere surrounding us. After about an hour, one of the locals began to stir. Without hesitation, Ivan shut the door behind him, leaving me alone while he spoke with the man. Moments later, raised voices erupted from the other side of the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of a scuffle. My heart leapt and I froze in my chair, the tension knotting in my chest. What the hell am I doing here? I thought to myself. My earlier suspicions about Alexei, the village chief, flared anew. This was beginning to feel like something darker than just an exploratory mission. But I was too far in, too far to turn back. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and the 2 men, now conscious, stumbled out. They looked to be in their 40s, their faces bloated and weary, eyes bloodshot. They bore the unmistakable appearance of longtime drunks, men I might have encountered in the seedier parts of any city. One of them, swaying slightly, pointed a finger at me and said something in Russian. The other laughed, their tone mocking. Their amusement was unsettling. Ivan snapped at them sharply, his voice rough and commanding. The men quickly fell silent, though their smirks lingered, and their gazes were still tinged with derision. "Get ready," Ivan said curtly, checking his watch. "We're running out of time." "How are we getting out of here?" I asked, still feeling like we were trapped in this remote, desolate place. "If we head east for about 10 miles, Ivan said with a shrug, "there's a settlement. People, reindeer, they'll help." The information gave me a faint glimmer of hope. At least now we had a plan, something concrete to aim for. I packed up my belongings, pulled on my coat, and gathered my equipment. We stepped outside. The landscape was the same endless white expanse. Snow crunched beneath our boots, and the faint smell of smoke from the rail car lingered in the frigid air. The strange tracks I'd seen earlier that morning crept back into my mind, sending a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the image of the old man and the young Saha with their fearful faces and reluctance to proceed. What did they know that I didn't? We set off. Ivan walked with purpose, as though he had a map in his head. Before long, a small grove of trees appeared ahead, their dark forms stark against the snowy horizon. The trees stood bare, their branches reaching skyward like twisted fingers. The forest was silent, almost lifeless, and the stillness was unsettling. Ivan didn't stop, and I followed him. As we ventured deeper into the grove, the tall trees closed in around us, their skeletal forms seeming to swallow us whole. A light wind stirred the branches, producing a faint rustling sound, but otherwise the silence was so profound that I could hear my own breathing. After some time, Ivan halted abruptly. Before us lay a massive pit, as if the earth had collapsed in on itself. The edges were jagged with chunks of ice and frozen soil. The sight was haunting, like an open wound on the tundra. I approached cautiously, peering down into the abyss. At the bottom, a dark cave mouth yawned, descending into unknown depths. My heart skipped a beat. This was the place I had heard about but had never imagined looking like this. I began to understand what they had found here. This wasn't just a mine or a dig site. This was something older, something far more enigmatic. "There it is," Ivan said with a faint smirk, glancing at me. We made it. The cave beckoned with its impenetrable darkness, yet it radiated a primal fear that rooted me to the spot. This wasn't just an excavation. It was the gateway to something ancient and terrifying. Ivan secured a rope ladder to 2 metal stakes hammered into the frozen ground. The ladder dangled down into the darkness of the pit, disappearing into the void of the cave below. I swallowed hard. The descent was steep, and the cold wind rising from the depths only heightened my unease. "Down," Ivan ordered curtly, testing the ladder's stability before beginning his descent. I followed, gripping the ropes tightly. The ladder swayed under my weight, and each step felt precarious, but after a few tense minutes, I reached solid ground. 2 workers already below shone their flashlights around, illuminating the cavern's damp stone walls. To my surprise, the cave was warm. The permafrost seemed to have halted at the surface, leaving the air inside humid. Beneath my boots was not icy earth, but a soft, almost warm surface. The walls, streaked with mineral deposits, seemed ancient, as though they were deliberately hiding secrets from view. I couldn't fathom how such warmth existed here, but I set the thought aside and pressed on. We moved deeper into the cave, the beams of our flashlights catching details along the way. Smooth stone walls, strange crystalline formations, and layers of sediment that seemed undisturbed for centuries. I took out a container and collected a soil sample, sealing it in a jar. Then, using an analyzer, I scanned the area. The results indicated a high likelihood of carbon-based deposits, potentially diamonds. "Pickaxe," I said, gesturing to one of the workers. Wordlessly, he handed me the tool. I began chipping at the wall, dislodging dirt and small stones. After a few minutes, I collected another sample. The analysis confirmed my suspicions. My heart raced. "There could be diamonds here," I said, trying to keep my excitement in check. "Start digging in different areas." Ivan translated my instructions to the workers, and they sprang into action. Each chose a spot and began striking the walls with their pickaxes, the sound echoing through the cavern. I stood back, observing the process and jotting down notes. After about 20 minutes, one of the workers shouted something in Russian, his voice tinged with alarm. I turned to see him backing away from the wall, pointing to where his pickaxe had disappeared into an unexpected void. He had uncovered another passage, an opening hidden behind the rock. "What's there?" I asked, stepping closer. Ivan, his expression darkening, shone his flashlight into the gap. The workers began widening the hole, chipping away at the edges until the passage was large enough to enter. The beams of our flashlights pierced the darkness, revealing a second larger chamber beyond. "It's a tomb," one of the workers whispered, his voice trembling with awe. We crawled through the opening and entered the new chamber. The air felt heavier here, as though it carried the weight of centuries. The walls were covered in strange symbols, meticulously carved into the stone. I didn't recognize the language, but the patterns were precise and symmetrical, suggesting a ritualistic purpose. Scattered on the floor were fragments of stone, as if someone or something had tried to damage the space long ago. At the center of the chamber stood a sarcophagus, crafted from dark stone and etched with the same enigmatic symbols. In front of it was a small pedestal, and atop the pedestal lay a massive, faceted diamond. Its size was unreal, its edges catching the light and refracting it like a shard of pure ice. "Unbelievable," I whispered. But before I could process what I was seeing, one of the workers lunged forward. He grabbed the diamond, lifting it high above his head as if claiming a prize. "What are you doing?" Ivan shouted, his voice reverberating through the cavern. Another worker yelled something in Russian and rushed toward the first, their voices rising in a heated argument. They gestured wildly at the diamond, their greed unmistakable. The shouting grew louder, the tension more palpable. I stepped back, wanting to distance myself from the brewing conflict. Ivan tried to intervene, barking commands, but even his authority couldn't quell the storm of greed and anger. I took the opportunity to examine the chamber more closely. The symbols on the walls seemed almost alive, their patterns hypnotic. In some areas, faint remnants of drawings depicted humanoid figures, or perhaps beings that weren't entirely human. Scattered near the sarcophagus were small stones and fragments, as if this place had been disturbed before. My gaze fell on the sarcophagus. It loomed massive and foreboding, its lid sealed tight. Something about it radiated an ancient, almost malevolent energy. My gut told me we had trespassed into a place that should have been left undisturbed. The workers' shouting had died down, and they seemed to have reached some kind of agreement. But the looks they started casting in my direction made me feel uneasy. There was a strange gleam in their eyes, something I couldn't quite read, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing good was hidden behind it. They began rummaging through the tomb, inspecting every corner, every inch of the floor and walls in search of more treasures. Despite their efforts, nothing else was found. Frustration grew, and one of them, the one who had first seized the diamond, approached the sarcophagus. He examined it closely, touching the carvings and indentations as if searching for a way to open it. "Hey, maybe you shouldn't do that," I said, but my words seemed to dissolve into the echoing silence of the cavern. The worker didn't even bother to acknowledge me. His companions watched in silence, while Ivan frowned, staring off into the distance. Before long, the worker found a mechanism, something resembling a hidden lever. A faint click was followed by the grinding sound of stone moving against stone, and the lid of the sarcophagus began to slowly slide open. When the lid was fully removed, we saw her. Inside lay a girl, stunningly beautiful, almost indescribably so. Her skin was smooth like porcelain, her lips slightly parted, and her long, dark hair framed her face like a cascade of silk. She looked as if she were merely asleep, so lifelike in appearance. She wore a simple yet elegant dress reminiscent of another era, and around her neck hung a chain with a large gemstone that caught the light from our flashlights, scattering sparks across the walls. I froze, staring at her. My mind raced with questions. How had she been preserved so perfectly? It was impossible. No embalming technique or natural condition could account for such preservation. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, that we had disturbed something ancient and sacred. But my thoughts were interrupted by one of the workers. Carefully, he reached for the chain around her neck and removed it. The gemstone was now in his hand. At that moment, a deep, resonant roar filled the cavern, a sound like a beast's, but much deeper and louder. It came from somewhere outside, from the direction we had entered. The workers froze. Even Ivan turned pale, clutching his rifle. Their faces displayed genuine fear, the same fear I had seen earlier in the Saka Elder. They began to panic, hastily gathering their tools and flashlights. One of the workers shouted something in Russian, his voice trembling. "What was that?" I asked Ivan. "I don't know. We need to leave. Quickly," he replied, motioning for me to follow. "No time." "But I need to take more samples," I protested, but he shook his head firmly. "No, move, now." We hurried to the rope ladder. The workers crowded around it, climbing up in a rush. Their movements were frantic, almost desperate. Ivan shoved me forward, signaling for me to go first. The ladder swayed, but I climbed as quickly as I could, feeling fear tighten around my chest. The roar sounded again, closer this time. It was so deep, it felt as if the vibrations were coming from beneath the earth itself. We all made it out, but no one slowed down. We hurried back toward the rail car. Ivan led the way, his rifle at the ready. We moved as fast as the deep snow would allow. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following us. The forest we passed through now seemed far more sinister. The shadows cast by the trees stretched long, forming twisted shapes that almost appeared to move. When we reached the rail car, everyone was on the verge of panic. Ivan quickly opened the door, pulling us inside. The workers collapsed onto the benches, gasping for breath. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling. I looked around at them and thought, what kind of forces have we disturbed? And what price will we have to pay for it? I sat on the bench in the rail car, watching Ivan, who stood by the window smoking, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. His face was focused, but tension radiated from him. I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Ivan? What was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, even though I was shaking inside. He shot me a quick glance but said nothing, only taking another deep drag and exhaling a plume of smoke. It was clear he didn't want to talk. The workers sat silently, their faces still marked with traces of panic, but the atmosphere in the rail car gradually began to calm. We were in a sheltered place, and that fact provided a small measure of comfort. "What now?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Ivan remained quiet. Instead, he opened his bag, peeked inside, and, satisfied that the diamond was still there, zipped it shut tightly. I noticed that the bag had never left his side. Much like the rifle, he now kept firmly in his grip. His behavior was unnerving, as was the fact that the workers kept whispering to each other, occasionally throwing strange glances in my direction. I began to suspect that things were taking a dark turn. Maybe they had decided to keep the diamond for themselves, and I, as an unnecessary witness, had become a burden. Their dismissive attitude toward the stupid foreigner only reinforced my suspicions, but I didn't let on that I was worried. Instead, I acted as though I hadn't noticed anything. When night fell, I knew that sleeping would be dangerous. If they truly planned something against me, it would happen now. I positioned myself in a corner, wrapped myself in my jacket, and pretended to sleep, though I stayed alert. Around midnight, one of the workers, the one who had taken the necklace from the tomb, stood and headed toward the door. He mumbled something to Ivan, who simply nodded without taking his eyes off his bag. The rail car door opened, letting in a gust of icy air, and the worker disappeared into the night. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just a trivial matter. But then I heard the scream. It was piercing, filled with raw terror, and it shattered the stillness of the night. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding, a cold hand of dread squeezing my stomach. Ivan immediately grabbed his rifle, his eyes flashing with alarm. The scream grew louder. It wasn't just fear. It sounded as if the man were being tortured, as if he had seen something no human should ever witness. I glanced at the two remaining workers. They didn't rush to help him or reach for their weapons. Instead, they whispered to each other, as if deliberating over something. "Don't you hear that?" I shouted, pointing at the door. Ivan raised a hand sharply, motioning for me to be quiet. His face had gone pale as paper. The screaming continued. The man was shouting something in Russian, but I couldn't make out the words. "Ivan, what's happening?" I repeated, but he didn't respond. The scream dragged on for several more minutes. I couldn't make sense of what was happening outside, but a growing horror consumed me. This wasn't just an animal attack or an accident. Something was happening out there that defied understanding. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence fell. A silence so profound it felt as though even my own breathing had ceased. We all froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the faint whistle of the wind. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside the rail car. "Who is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ivan didn't answer. He raised his rifle, aiming it at the door. The workers sat motionless, their faces a blend of fear and resignation. The footsteps drew closer. Each sound rang in my ears like the toll of a bell. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mind raced, screaming that it could be anything. An animal, a person, or something far worse. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. We stood frozen in front of the door, tense as coiled springs ready to snap. Ivan held his rifle steady, aimed directly at the entrance. The worker stood to the side, his face pale with fear, his hands trembling. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, but my heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was certain it would give us away. Outside, heavy breathing broke the silence. Low and deep, it sounded as if something was standing just a few steps away, staring straight at us through the thin walls of the rail car. Each inhale and exhale reverberated in my skull like thunderous beats, and a cold knot twisted in my stomach. This was no human breath, nor any animal I could imagine. Something ancient and terrifying loomed in the darkness. The breathing grew closer. My fists clenched, and I could feel cold sweat trickling down my back despite the freezing air. None of us moved or exchanged glances. Then suddenly the breathing stopped and there were footsteps. Whatever it was, it moved away. For several minutes, no one dared to move or speak. Only when the sound of the footsteps faded entirely did I see Ivan slowly lower his rifle. None of us slept that night. We sat in tense silence, each of us retreating to a corner of the rail car. Ivan remained quiet, occasionally checking the bag that held the diamond. I couldn't sleep either, caught between two fears, the unknown terror lurking outside and the men inside who I no longer trusted. At dawn, Ivan was the first to rise. He carefully approached the door and cracked it open, peering outside. "Move," he said curtly, motioning for me to follow. I grabbed my jacket, made sure I had my essentials, and stepped out into the frigid air. The icy wind bit at my face, but it was nothing compared to what I saw. In the snow before the rail car were tracks, the same ones I had seen near the cabin. I froze, my heart sinking. "Damn," I whispered under my breath. We moved forward. Blood stained the snow, stark red against the white expanse. There was a lot of it, but no body to be found. The scene was haunting, as if someone had been dragged away. The workers exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale, but none of them said a word. It was clear they had no intention of searching for their missing companion. Ivan motioned for us to keep moving. We gathered our things and headed east, where he claimed there was a settlement. The tundra greeted us with a biting wind that whipped snow into our faces. I followed behind the two remaining workers, occasionally glancing back at them. My suspicions only grew with every step. They whispered to each other far too often, and their glances grew increasingly unsettling. I felt they might attack at any moment. I kept walking, trying to keep them in my peripheral vision while maintaining a calm demeanor. As we trudged on, the snowfall grew heavier, eventually turning into a full-blown blizzard. The wind lashed at our faces, tearing the breath from our lungs, and visibility dropped rapidly. We walked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. For me, the blizzard felt like both a blessing and a curse. It shielded me from the monster outside, but hid the potential danger from behind. After about half an hour, the storm had become nearly impenetrable. I relied on my compass to stay on course, moving forward almost blindly. The worker was behind me, and Ivan brought up the rear. I could hear their footsteps trailing close, but then I realized something unsettling. The sound of their steps had disappeared. I stopped, intending to turn around, but I tripped over something and fell face first into the snow. Before I could gather my thoughts, a gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past my head, striking the snow ahead of me. I spun around to see Ivan, rifle raised, his face twisted with fury. He shouted something in Russian as he loaded another round. "Damn, he's trying to kill me," the thought screamed in my mind. The worker shouted something too, urging Ivan on, but Ivan cursed back, clearly unwilling to relent. I knew I had no time to waste. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted into the raging blizzard. The wind slapped my face, the snow stung my eyes, but the storm became my only ally. Visibility was almost zero, and I could hear more gunshots behind me. The bullets vanished into the snowy void. They were chasing me. I was certain of it. But I didn't look back. I couldn't risk slowing down for even a second. I ran blindly, the snowstorm growing fiercer with every step. Snow pelted my face like 1,000 tiny needles, and the wind howled as if trying to warn me of some looming terror. Suddenly the howling changed, replaced by screams. No, not just screams, shrieks of terror and agony just like the ones we'd heard the previous night. Then came the roar, a deep, bone-chilling sound that froze me in my tracks. Damn it, it's back, I thought, a wave of icy fear locking my body in place. The screams came from behind me, followed by gunshots. Someone was trying to fight back, likely the second worker. The shrieks grew louder, mingling with the roar. I didn't need to look back to know what was happening. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, my legs sinking into the snow, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Why the hell did I come here? I cursed inwardly, blaming my boss, who'd called this trip a promising opportunity. The screams and the roar persisted, but they began to fade. I realized the creature was distracted by its new prey. This was my only chance. I pushed forward, running until my lungs burned and I couldn't breathe. Finally, I slowed, gasping for air. Everything around me was white. Visibility was almost zero. The snowstorm had turned into an impenetrable wall. My compass was my only guide. I forced myself to move east, but the cold gnawed at my body, and exhaustion was beginning to take hold. The tundra was desolate. There was no sound but the relentless howling of the wind. Occasionally, I thought I heard something, footsteps, maybe whispers. But every time I turned, there was nothing but endless snow. This place felt infinite. After what felt like hours, my strength gave out. I fell to my knees, then collapsed face first into the snow. The cold burned, but in a strange way it was comforting, as if this were the end. My eyes began to close when suddenly I caught a scent. Faint but unmistakable, the smell of a fire. It came to me on the wind, subtle but real. I lifted my head. The scent was coming from the north. Maybe the wind had carried it far, but it was my only hope. Gathering the last of my strength, I rose and trudged toward the smell. Every step was a struggle. The blizzard lashed at my face, but the smell grew stronger. Then through the snowy haze I saw it, a dark silhouette. A yurt. The yurt was low, its wooden frame covered in felt. It looked sturdy, built to withstand the harsh winds and snow. Outside, a wooden pole stood with animal skins tied to it, likely a talisman for warding off evil spirits. A faint glow of firelight flickered through a small opening in the roof. I approached the felt door, which flapped wildly in the wind, and with what little strength I had left, I pushed it open. Stumbling inside, I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. Warmth enveloped me, and the air was thick with the scent of fire, meat, and something herbal. When I lifted my head, I saw him. The old man who had driven us in the sled. His face was a mix of surprise and concern. Beside him was his family. A woman, likely his wife, wrapped in a thick fur robe, and 2 children. A boy and a girl around 10 years old, huddled together in fear. They stared at me in silence, as if I were a ghost that had stumbled out of the storm. "Help?" I croaked, barely able to form the word. The old man sprang to his feet, his expression wary but not panicked. His wife followed immediately, and together they helped me up and guided me closer to the fire. The flames crackled softly, their warmth seeping into my frozen body. The old man gestured for me to sit, then began removing my soaked outer layers with quick yet gentle hands, as though he had done this countless times before. His wife brought thick furs and pieces of felt, wrapping them tightly around me. She handed me a wooden cup filled with a steaming hot drink. I took a sip and tasted herbs. Sharp, slightly bitter, but searingly warm. The heat spread through me, driving away the cold and the lingering terror that had gripped me moments earlier. I sat by the fire, finally, feeling a faint trace of safety. As my body warmed, my mind began to cloud, and exhaustion crept over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't even notice when I fell asleep. When I opened my eyes, the fire was still burning. The same people were there. The old man, his wife, and their children huddled together and speaking softly. But now there were 2 more figures. One of them, the young Saka man who had driven the sled, and the other, Ivan. Ivan sat near the fire, holding a cup of the same hot drink. His clothes were damp, and he was squeezing water from the edges of his coat, clearly having just arrived. When he noticed I was awake, his gaze met mine and a slow smile crept across his face. It wasn't reassuring. It was unsettling, a smile that sent a chill through me despite the fire's warmth. I looked around, feeling dread creeping back into my chest. The old man appeared calm, but his sharp eyes remained fixed on Ivan, watching his every move. That brought me a measure of comfort. As long as the yurt's owners were here, Ivan couldn't harm me. Next to him, I noticed the bag, the one containing the diamond. That meant the second worker had perished out there in the tundra, leaving Ivan as the sole survivor. But at what cost? We sat in tense silence. The family seemed unable to discern the nature of our relationship, but their wary glances showed they sensed the underlying tension. "When did you get here?" I finally asked Ivan. "Not long ago," he replied curtly, glancing at his damp clothing. His answer seemed truthful, but it did nothing to ease my nerves. I didn't press further, but the oppressive sense of danger didn't leave me. Then the howl came. That same low, guttural howl I had come to dread. It pierced the silence, cutting through the wailing storm outside. Blood froze in my veins, and it felt as though an icy hand had clenched around my heart. This wasn't an animal's cry. It carried with it a primal, ancient terror. I glanced at the others. The old man had gone pale, his eyes darting around the yurt's walls as if searching for an escape. His wife clutched their children tightly, whispering words of comfort in her native tongue. The young Saka man froze, his hand inching toward the rifle leaning against the wall. Ivan stiffened as well. He grabbed the bag containing the diamond and his rifle, clutching them as if his life depended on it. His face betrayed a mix of fear and determination, and it was clear he was prepared to shoot at anything that came too close. Fear washed over me in waves. The yurt's thin felt walls felt fragile against the unknown horror prowling outside, and then I heard it. Heavy, wet breathing. It was louder than the wind, as though something massive was standing just beyond the yurt's door. It didn't move, only breathed, each exhale resonating with an almost deliberate menace. "Damn it," I muttered, though the words barely escaped my throat. Ivan rose slowly, his movements deliberate. The old man and the Saka youth were already gripping their weapons, their eyes locked on the door. The children began to cry softly, but their mother held them close, murmuring soothing words. Everything fell silent except for the breathing. The sound hung in the air, thick and oppressive, as though it could crush us under its weight. We all sat frozen, prey cornered by an unseen predator. The breathing continued, steady and unrelenting. My grip on reality faltered, and I realized with terrifying clarity that whatever was outside wasn't just hunting us. It was toying with us. We stood in silence, bracing ourselves for the worst. The breathing outside the door grew louder, heavier, raspier, as though coming from an immense chest, struggling to contain the air it held. The blizzard outside seemed to pause, as if even nature itself had held its breath, watching to see what would happen. Suddenly, the felt door of the yurt twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if something were testing whether it could be moved. We all froze. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain whatever was outside could hear it. The fabric shifted again, this time more deliberately. The firelight danced on the door, and then a hand appeared. It wasn't human. The hand was covered in thick, dark fur with elongated fingers, ending in massive claws that gleamed in the fire's glow. Slowly, the fabric was pushed aside, and it stepped inside. It was a werewolf. Towering over any human, its body was massive yet disturbingly agile, a grotesque blend of man and wolf. Its elongated snout bristled with fur, its glowing yellow eyes cold and piercing like lanterns in the dark. Sharp, glistening fangs protruded from its snarling mouth, drool dripping onto the yurt floor. The creature moved with deliberate grace, its claws scraping against the floor and leaving deep gouges. Every movement exuded an unsettling confidence, as if it knew none of us could stop it. I was frozen, unable to breathe. Its gaze scanned the room, lingering on each of us in turn before settling on Ivan, or rather on his bag. It all became clear. It was here for the diamond. I began to back away slowly, gesturing to the family to do the same. They understood and retreated toward the farthest corner, clutching their children tightly. Ivan, clutching his rifle, stood his ground. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression was resolute. He wasn't going to give it up without a fight. The creature stepped to the side, moving to flank him. Ivan reacted instantly, pulling the trigger. The gunshot thundered in the confined space, deafening us. The bullet struck the werewolf in the chest, causing it to stagger momentarily. For a brief second, I thought it might fall, but instead, it let out an earth-shaking roar. The yurt seemed to tremble under the force of the sound. Then, with terrifying speed, it leapt at Ivan. Ivan fired again, but it wasn't enough. The werewolf slammed into him, sending the rifle skittering across the floor. We cowered in the corner, huddled together like frightened children, hiding behind the furs and trying to disappear into the walls. I watched in horror as Ivan screamed, trying to fight back. He clung to the bag with desperate strength, but the creature ripped it away with one hand and pinned him down with the other. The struggle lasted mere seconds, but felt like an eternity. The werewolf hoisted Ivan into the air as if he weighed nothing, clutching him and the bag tightly. Then, in one fluid motion, it burst through the yurt's entrance, tearing the felt covering from the frame. Icy air and snow swirled inside, chilling us to the bone. Outside, Ivan's screams tore through the night, filled with agony and terror. His cries were so piercing they seemed to rip the very fabric of reality. Then came the creature's roar, followed by sickening sounds. Thuds, cracks, and the unmistakable crunch of breaking bones. Ivan's voice grew weaker with each passing second until it was gone entirely. Silence fell. A silence so profound it felt as though the world itself had stopped. We sat in the yurt, paralyzed. The old man still clutched his weapon, his knuckles white. His wife held the children close, murmuring words of comfort even as her own face betrayed the depth of her fear. The young Saka man sat nearby, breathing heavily, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The cold crept into the yurt, not from the storm, but from the lingering presence of what had just happened. I spent the rest of the night wrapped in furs, but sleep was impossible. Every rustle of the wind outside made my heart leap. The werewolf's presence had left an indelible mark on the air, and we were all painfully aware of how vulnerable we were. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie, oppressive silence. The yurt felt like a fragile bubble in a frozen wasteland, barely holding back the darkness that loomed just beyond its walls. The next day, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the gray tundra sky, the old man and his family began preparing me for the journey ahead. Despite the fear etched into their faces from the night before, they treated me with kindness. The old man said something in his native tongue, and his wife handed me warm clothing and a small bundle of food for the road. We moved quickly, leaving behind the yurt and the lingering memories of the horrors that still felt too close. the old man and the young Saka helped me reach the nearest settlement. We traveled slowly but steadily on a sled pulled by reindeer. The snow still lay in deep drifts, but the sky had cleared slightly, with weak sunlight breaking through the veil of clouds. I didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: I never wanted to return to this place. When we reached the settlement, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. The streets were deserted, and the wind still whistled through the narrow spaces between houses. I made my way to the house where I had left my belongings, and there I was greeted by Alexei. Alexei stood at the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. His stern face seemed even grimmer as he listened to my account. I recounted everything in detail: the tomb, the diamond, the werewolf, and Ivan's horrifying screams. His brows furrowed deeper with every word, but he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he nodded slowly, as if weighing my story. "This is bad," he finally said. "All of it. Very bad." I couldn't tell if he believed me. Perhaps he thought I had lost my mind, but that didn't matter anymore. "I need to leave. Now. Get me to the airport," I said. He hesitated for a moment before nodding again. "All right." Alexei arranged for a car, and the driver took me to the airport. During the ride, I sat in silence, staring at the snow-covered landscapes that now felt alien and hostile. All I wanted was to leave this place as quickly as possible. When I finally reached the airport, the sense of relief was so overwhelming that it made me dizzy. I booked the first available flight to Moscow, and as soon as the plane lifted off, I was able to relax for the first time in what felt like an eternity. As I left this cursed place behind, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. The werewolf, the tomb, the girl, it all felt like a scene from a terrible nightmare. But I knew it had been real. No one would believe me, that much was certain. Yet that no longer mattered. My mission now was clear: to convince my boss that this place should remain untouched. What was the creature guarding that tomb? Had the girl in the sarcophagus come back to life? I didn't know, and I probably never would. Some mysteries are best left unsolved, and this was one of them.